Hi everyone, Sam Alexander here from the Simplicity Institute. Welcome back to another episode in the Ecological Civilisation series. Playlist above, please subscribe, free ebooks in the description below. Although my introductions are getting more efficient, I should note from the outset that today I'll be presenting a rather detailed line of argument and analysis. So you're welcome to watch the talk over a couple of sittings if that's your preference, and I've made timestamps in the description below for those who might want to jump around to specific areas of interest. In the last presentation called Ecovillage Future, I suggested that one way to envisage what an ecological civilization might look like is to imagine a world made up of millions of loosely connected ecovillages and eco-neighbourhoods. This would certainly include some rural settlements and numerous small farms on the urban periphery, but it's of fundamental importance that urban and suburban landscapes where most of us live today are also transformed into low-impact living. As I've mentioned before, David Holmgren's book Retro Suburbia is a fantastic resource for people seeking practical detail on how our cities, the suburbs in particular, could be retrofitted to better accord with permaculture design principles. And as discussed in the last presentation, the Dancing Rabbit Eco-Village provides an inspiring example of a community that is living on a small fraction of the average US energy and resource consumption while maintaining high quality of life. So the degrowth idea of a prosperous descent seems not just possible, but given the right conditions, but also already exemplified by pioneering individuals and communities. This is good news, and let's not lose sight of these glimmers of hope. Although I accept that an eco-village and eco-neighbourhood future might seem like a distant and perhaps utopian prospect, I believe that this vision is basically where we need to end up in coming decades if we are to avoid ecosystemic collapse and achieve a just and sustainable way of life. So it's a goal worth taking seriously, even if the transition is likely to be slow, difficult, compromised, and at best only partially successful. It's sometimes said that we humans get our instructions from visions and dreams. And in that spirit, I think trying to envision a truly sustainable society can help guide action today. After all, we need to begin from where we are in the midst of a growth-orientated industrial civilization, but we also need to imagine where we want to end up. Otherwise, we won't know in what direction to head or where best to invest our energies. Starting from where we are, necessary though that is, can make the transitional challenge seem quite daunting, I admit. But as political theorist J.K. Gibson Graham argues, let's not think of capitalism with a capital C as the single totalizing system that we need to deconstruct and transform all in one go. Gibson Graham suggests that we should reframe things and think in terms of relations and relationships rather than monolithic systems. Yes, the world is dominated by capitalist relations, but non-capitalist or post-capitalist relations already exist today, whether that is simply sharing things with neighbours, attending a food swap, guerrilla gardening, or joining your local transition town or community garden. These actions take place beyond the formal marketplace, and none of them are undertaken to maximise profits or to accumulate private wealth. The task we face is to seek out nourishing forms of social and economic interaction that already exist beyond capitalist relations, to try to support those post-capitalist relations so that they proliferate and take root, thereby creating the cultural conditions for systemic change. In this way, we could say that a post-capitalist society isn't some future or distant state. It already exists today in the here and now, if only partially, waiting for more people to tend to the soil and seedlings of change. Of course, capitalist relations may never fully disappear from our lives, certainly not in the near term, but over time we can and should imagine a world, an eco-village future, where social and economic life is governed not by the unsustainable pursuit of profit maximisation and limitless accumulation, but on the alternative values of cooperation, solidarity, and sustainability. And people can and should and are beginning to prefigure that world today, so let's keep on keeping on with defiant positivity. Trying to live an eco-village existence in the here and now is part of the challenge, compromised though it will always be. The second half of my presentation on eco-villages examined the complex issue of land. I won't try to rehash the entire argument, but the central point was that gaining access to land, and therefore housing, is a major structural barrier to sustainable living in most contexts today. Land can be so expensive that it locks most of us into a 9-to-5 job in an unsustainable economy merely to afford a place to live. For those who are able to afford a house with solar panels and enough land to grow some food, this might have required decades of successfully opting into the system in order to be able to afford to opt out, so to speak, which is consequently a compromised example of sustainability practice because it can be hard for most people to follow in those footsteps. Drawing on the work of Alex Bauman and Chris Ballman, I reviewed a policy that was based on public housing in an attempt to expand the imagination about societal structures that are more consistent with genuine and inclusive sustainability. Public housing presents an opportunity for most people to relate to land in a fundamentally different way than through the private market. It was also suggested as a transitional strategy that a modest participation income could be provided to public housing residents who wanted to participate in the creation of community economies that provided for local needs. The basic idea here would be to seed examples of localized community economies that were based upon access to public, non-commodified land, and over time demonstrate that this model fundamentally liberates people from participating in consumer culture and the growth economy. This is the type of societal system we need. In summary then, the proposed policy of public housing coupled with a participation income could help create societal structures that empower people to lead a degrowth transition to an eco-village or eco-neighbourhood future. And I feel that access to land is a sorely neglected issue by most sustainability advocates, so I'd be happy if the recent discussion provokes thought and some new conversations. For more information on these issues, see the links in the description below. So that's where we concluded in the last presentation, with a recognition that ecovillages like Dancing Rabbit enable a low impact but high quality of life existence, but that access to land is a barrier to more people embracing the ecovillage way of living. In order to begin introducing today's content, let's recall a famous phrase by Buckminster Fuller that I've quoted in previous presentations. He says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." I'm quite sympathetic to this statement, in the sense at least that I feel that trying to prefigure the world we want is a powerful way to drive change from the grassroots up. We may not be able to influence the big corporations or have much sway over our politicians, but we have more agency in our own lives and local communities. Fuller's approach to social transformation essentially expresses the idea that examples are powerful, that examples can send ripples through culture further than we might think possible, creating cultural currents that can turn into subcultures, that sometimes explode into social movements, and that on very rare occasions can spark a revolution in consciousness that changes the world. In an age when it can sometimes seem as if there is no alternative to the carbon-intensive consumer way of life, being exposed to a real-world example of new ways of living and being has the potential to expand and radicalize the ecological imagination. Faced with living proof that life can be different, if only at first in a microcosm, the structures and narratives that define our lives can suddenly seem less compelling. In this way, examples of alternative ways to live can challenge us to be examples ourselves, can challenge us to live experimentally within the cracks of capitalism in the hope of setting ourselves free. Indeed, nothing mobilizes a community of people quite like the taste of freedom. Soon enough, in the flow of revolt, a new model can make the old model obsolete. Buckminster Fuller's advice, however, compelling though it is, I think overstates the singular importance of building the new world and thereby diminishes the often necessary task of deconstructing or fighting the existing world and its structures of power. So while I largely agree with Fuller's guidance, I think it would be politically naive to exclude the importance of acts of resistance in change-making strategy. In other words, sometimes we just need to fight or resist the existing world, even if our main goal in doing so is to make it easier to build the new world. And if we look historically at the various social movements that have changed the world, it is obvious that resistance movements have been at least as significant as movements that have prefigured the new world. And of course, there are times when an individual and movement can and should do both. So I feel this is an occasion when we can justifiably sit on the theoretical fence, so to speak, and recognize that we simply need more of both modes of transformation, acts of resistance and acts of renewal. And the assessment we need to make in our unique personal circumstances is, where can our individual actions and energies be most useful and impactful? And that leads me to today's topic, Extinction Rebellion and Acts of Civil Disobedience. Over the course of this presentation, I'd like to discuss questions of resistance and rebellion, to assess the activist strategies of Extinction Rebellion, and to evaluate the arguments for and against civil disobedience. I feel this analysis is a necessary supplement to the previous presentations, which have focused more on building the new world than resisting or deconstructing the existing world. Interestingly, you'll see that in some ways we've come full circle here, because you will recall that in one of the earlier presentations we explored Henry Thoreau's Ethics of Material Sufficiency, link above, which I argued provided some philosophical foundations to an ecological civilization. As well as his environmental philosophy, however, Thoreau also wrote one of the most important early statements on civil disobedience in his famous essay, Resistance to Civil Government. And this work and the people and movements it inspired has helped give rise to Extinction Rebellion. So let's take a closer look at this contemporary movement, what it stands for, and what strategies it applies. Extinction Rebellion, as I've said, has emerged as one of the most active and prominent faces of the environmental movement around the world. It was birthed in the UK in May 2018, and one of the movement's early actions was to mobilise activists to block 5 major bridges in London, conscientiously breaking the law with the intention of disrupting the city as significantly as possible using strictly non-violent techniques. The goal of these and similar disruptions and occupations was to bring more attention to the intensifying risks and realities of climate breakdown, to the ongoing decimation of wildlife populations, and to the failures of governments to stop the onslaught of ecosystems and species globally. Quickly, the movement exploded into direct action in many parts of the world, everywhere committed to disrupting society as strategically as possible, using non-violent mass action as a tool for societal change. In this first phase, blocking traffic on busy roads was a prominent tactic. While a protest on a particular issue may come and go, a rebellion defines itself by the breadth of its opposition and the refusal to fade away even in the face of slow progress and backlash from the state, or even in the face of a pandemic that prohibits mass mobilizations in the streets. Whether Extinction Rebellion can live up to its name remains to be seen, but the forces of resistance do seem to be simmering, threatening to boil, even if the last couple of years of pandemic lockdowns have added new obstacles in the path of mass mobilization. Extinction Rebellion, or XR, has 3 principles or demands. Government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. Governments must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. Governments must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. All these principles deserve critical consideration and ongoing debate, and reasonable people, I think, can accept them, challenge them, or disagree with aspects of them. Indeed, XR itself views these demands as part of an ongoing process of discussion and refinement, and how the movement and its key issues are framed has not been free from criticism, even by sympathetic voices. But there is a clear distinction between XR and most other forms of thinking and practice in the environmental movement today. In the attempt to respond appropriately to climate breakdown and the broader environmental crisis, XR is explicitly holding up non-violent civil disobedience as an important and perhaps necessary part of the socio-political strategy for achieving a just and sustainable world. It follows that any examination of XR must assess the unsettling strategy of civil disobedience, that is, the practice of non-violently breaking the law to advance social, political, or environmental causes. Uncomfortable though it can make us feel, it is important for a society to understand the motivations for civil disobedience and evaluate the reasons given for practicing this radical and disruptive strategy for societal change. Some commentators will be tempted to dismiss XR activists as troublemakers or even criminals, but such reactions, though understandable, risk mischaracterizing these ethically motivated actions that are designed to be confronting, inconvenient, and disruptive for a noble cause. Even though most of us probably have reservations and concerns about civil disobedience, we must appreciate that many of the most significant social and political advances over the last century owe much to social movements that engaged in civil disobedience as a primary strategy. One might think especially of Gandhi and the independence movement from British rule, the suffragette movement, and the civil rights movement. I should note that the challenges of those movements and the challenges of XR are qualitatively different. Comparisons between the movements can be problematic or misleading at times. Nevertheless, these esteemed traditions raise the disconcerting question: might future advances in society also demand civil disobedience? And might more civil disobedience be coming, whether people want it or not? In what follows, I will argue that XR and rebellions like it are almost certainly going to grow in coming years as more people around the world become politically frustrated, angry, scared, and directly impacted by inaction in the face of today's overlapping ecological and humanitarian crises. I call this anticipated growth in XR and related movements the rebellion hypothesis, and I explain what I mean in more detail shortly. Although I sympathise with the broad goals of XR and have participated in many XR events and given talks to the Melbourne contingent, my argument today is not that this and related movements should grow, a question I leave open for this audience to determine for themselves. My argument is that they will grow as behavioural shifts in society or psychological tipping points are provoked by the ongoing deterioration of Earth systems and rising existential threats to the community of life. Put otherwise, I will defend the proposition that inaction has diminishing marginal returns, which makes social resistance more likely over time, since the real and perceived cost-benefit analysis of the environmental predicament tilts in favour of collective action. Whether this mobilisation occurs in time to avoid worst-case scenarios, however, is unknowable. Although my focus today is specifically on XR, the primary argument is about the anticipated rise of environmental activism more generally in coming years and decades, irrespective of whether these uprisings continue to march under the banner of Extinction Rebellion. So I've got more to say about civil disobedience and Extinction Rebellion shortly, but I'd like to spend a few minutes presenting the line of argument which I'm calling the rebellion hypothesis. I hope that this analysis demonstrates why XR and similar movements deserve our attention and explains why they are likely to grow in coming years. So it seems to me that there is a collective rumbling in the world today, a growing anger and anxiety about the troubled future that is unfolding day by day, and a growing sense that if governments are not going to act decisively in response to today's overlapping ecological and social crises, then ordinary people like you and me will have to be the driving force for change. But feeling anger and anxiety about environmental breakdown and the unfolding extinction of species does not automatically translate into collective action, certainly not into government action. The history of widespread apathy or half-hearted resistance testifies to this truth. Many people share their sense of dread with their friends and family, but who have yet to mobilise and connect with activist or community groups. Others understand that the world is going to hell, but manage to distract themselves with modern seductions like social media, Netflix, or television more generally, in order to avoid facing the truth of our global predicament and the demands it is making on us. There's nothing inherently wrong with those forms of entertainment, of course. I'm no puritanical Luddite. They only become problematic or even dangerous when they become sedative and consume the entirety of our freedoms, leaving us with no time or headspace or desire to act in the world. It's easy to become disenchanted with the world and collapse into resignation or even despair. But why is it so easy to be complicit in ecocide and do little to resist? I think part of the answer is that even though the world is burning and billions are still living in conditions of destitution, life for many of us in developed nations is relatively comfortable. Australia, where I am based, is almost on top of the world in terms of prosperity, having more or less ducked the global financial crisis 10 years ago, and our fossil-fueled economy prior to the COVID-19 disruption at least was growing at a robust pace. Although the disruption caused by the pandemic has cast more people into economic insecurity, many still have discretionary income to spend on a trip overseas or a pair of jeans or shoes or a new computer or device and so forth. With important exceptions that must never be downplayed, not many people in the so-called first world go hungry, even if, again, the unsettling impacts of the pandemic must be acknowledged. And if our summer days reach infernal temperatures, we are generally able to turn on the air conditioners and temporarily hide ourselves from harsh ecological realities. The supermarket shelves are generally well stocked. There is always petrol at the service stations, and on-demand streaming television is always waiting to distract us if we need to self-medicate. Never in history has a comfortable and prosperous citizenry ignited a revolution or rebellion. When life is good or good enough, People do not mobilize to overthrow the system that seems to give them what they think they want. On what basis, then, do I formulate the rebellion hypothesis? Why should we expect mass mobilization of people in coming years? Let me explain by way of a simple allegory. Suppose you are on a boat with a large cake, and you suddenly notice that the boat has sprung a leak. The leak is slow and you do not panic. Instead, you cut yourself a slice of cake and it's delicious. As you finish the slice, you assess the leak again. A little water has gathered in the bottom of the boat, but nothing too alarming. So you cut yourself another slice of cake. This slice is also delicious, but perhaps not quite as good as the first one. Upon finishing your second slice, you notice that your feet are wet, which is a bit unsettling. It seems the leak has gotten worse, and yet you wouldn't mind another slice of cake. What do? Is it time to panic and act, or do you have another slice of cake? The point of this simple story is to highlight how over time the costs of inaction can grow and the rewards of doing the same old thing begin to decline. This shift will eventually influence our behavior. To borrow the language of economics, we might say that inaction has diminishing marginal returns. At first, inaction doesn't seem to cost much and might even offer rewards. Over time, the costs of inaction rise as the problems get worse. In this example, each piece of cake isn't quite as good as the last, while at the same time the costs of not addressing the leak are becoming ever more pressing. At some point, the tipping point, it becomes clear that the costs of inaction outweigh the benefits of more cake. At that point, the person in the boat switches from being a passive consumer into an engaged activist of whatever form. The meaning of their life has become animated by the desire to stop the boat from sinking. They have come to see that their life will be better if they act, so they act. Cake is no longer as important or as desirable as stopping the leak. So they substitute one form of life for a different form of life because the calculus has changed regarding actual or perceived costs and benefits. Those people already engaging in individual acts of resistance or collective action have passed their tipping points already. They have weighed up the costs and benefits of inaction and concluded that inaction now costs too much. At some point, the conscious or semi-conscious calculations regarding the question of whether to rebel produced a positive answer. Whether that moment was last week, last year, last decade, or for the more seasoned activists, even last century. Calls for a new environmental radicalism will be heard more loudly. The notion of a tipping point is normally used in relation to ecological systems, where small increments in damage can suddenly lead to swift and drastic change, often irreversible. I am using the same idea, but applying it to the human psychology of activism. Every day we become more aware that our planet is dying, putting the entire community of life at risk, whether it is the Arctic or the Amazon burning, or a new species that has gone extinct, or a new climate report explaining why climate breakdown is happening faster than expected. Each of these moments of awareness begin to add up, and yet often people don't respond with action or resistance. People can be bombarded with grim information about the ecological catastrophe unfolding, and yet remain locked into the ruts of life, doing today more or less what they did yesterday. Like the person in the boat, it is easier to continue eating or pursuing cake. This path is easily followed most of the time. But as Albert Camus once wrote, one day a why arises, and everything begins in that moment of wariness tinged with amazement. Begins, he says. This is important. One day a person asks, are we the people we have been waiting for? If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Perhaps my argument is getting clearer. I am suggesting that there is a growing affect for resistance and rebellion in the world. When I speak of the rebellion hypothesis, what I am suggesting is that in coming years, more and more people will join XR or related movements as the costs of inaction continue to rise and the rewards of being a passive bystander decline. It seems to me that this is more or less inevitable because the costs of environmental damage will inevitably increase and become ever more personal and immediate as capitalism continues to cannibalize itself and the planet. In other words, I believe a new economics of activism is dawning. Currently, so much of the violence being imparted by our industrial civilization is being externalized to other parts of the world or to others less fortunate or less powerful, including other species. This makes it easier to pretend that everything is fine and that we are not in an emergency. But as climate breakdown continues and the broader environmental crisis intensifies, the impacts will begin to be felt by more and more people, even in rich nations. For example, when extended drought or more severe flooding returns to or intensifies in Australia, as it seems to be destined to do, we will see more farmers joining XR or related movements as their livelihoods are directly threatened by climate change. More psychological tipping points will pass, and climate inaction as we know it today will be intolerable, a direct existential threat to their way of life. When those droughts lead to increases in food prices, the urban consumer might stop to think, hang on, this has been predicted by the scientists and it's begun to affect me personally. I'd better act. Their tipping points will pass. When the ice cap disappears in coming years or decades and the threat of rising sea levels becomes not a theoretical possibility but a practical problem, people living in coastal regions of the world will realize, as many already do, that climate change is not an abstract problem but something that could wash away their homes. Others will be affected by extreme weather events, fires, floods, cyclones, and their tipping point will also pass. When children realize that they will be inheriting an unstable climate system, or a world without panda bears or the Great Barrier Reef, they will mobilize and agitate, and soon enough they will enter the voting constituency and provoke a profound political shift. Their tipping point will pass, and we already see with the school strikes that they are in the process of tipping. It's only going to continue. A new generation is emerging and they see the world through a different lens. To some extent, this growing resistance is already underway. XR is hardly the first mobilisation in this vein. Think especially of the noble work of the global school strikes, which I just mentioned, or in Australia, the anti-Adani activists resisting new coal mines by locking themselves, for example, onto railway tracks to interfere with the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. The list is long, diverse, and esteemed. But my argument is that the costs of inaction are necessarily going to increase further, and as the Earth system deteriorates and fights back, the benefits of passive bystanding are going to seem less and less rewarding and socially acceptable. In other words, ever more people will experience a psychological tipping point. Your neighbour, your colleague at work, a child or police officer, perhaps eventually more politicians. Each of them has a threshold or tolerance, and their tipping points are approaching. A cultural shift may already be underway, even if it remains in its early stages. This cultural shift could eventually filter upwards and have profound political and macroeconomic effects. We are all in a lifeboat called Earth. In the 1960s and 70s, when the modern environmental movement got underway, people noticed a leak in the boat and recognized it to be dangerous. They spoke of a crisis in the future. Things continued to get worse, but most people couldn't resist the cake or the pursuit of cake. Not enough people mobilized to plug the leak. Now the boat is leaking disastrously and water is up to our necks. Some people are already drowning. Crisis has arrived. The future is now. And more of us are sick of cake. More and more of us have exceeded our threshold. Or, to change the metaphor, the floodgates are threatening to burst, and it's not clear that the growing energy of opposition can be contained. Furthermore, this growing force is going to lead to increasing pressure within society, like steam increasing in a closed system. As the resistance increases and becomes more energized, we can expect backlash from those still benefiting from the existing system. And again, we are seeing this already. But as the defenders of the status quo lash out and oppress the rising tide of resistance, what they will discover is that their actions in fact only mobilize more people, as the social license of the fossil fuel industry, corporate greed, and the politics of denial fade and ultimately disappear. In other words, one day state and corporate blindness or apathy in the face of worsening ecological crisis will offend public morality, and perhaps that day is closer than we think. Based on empirical studies, it's been estimated that only 3.5% of a population needs to mobilise to engage in collective action to induce deep structural and cultural change. While such estimations need to be interpreted critically and cautiously, and every context and situation is different, the point is that surprisingly small social mobilisations can have far-reaching impacts. Of course, such deep transformations do not happen overnight, but the history of disruptive social movements shows that things can change faster than one might at first think. The environmental movement may not need a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi to lead. Perhaps what is needed is 1,000 or 1,000,000 Rosa Parks to get things done through quiet but bold acts of resistance and renewal. Due to the momentum of global capitalism today, global environmental problems are almost certainly going to get worse before they get better, and this will only fuel the fire of rebellion. As I've argued at length in this series, there is an ecological contradiction built into our society, our economy, and our politics. The contradiction is the assumption that limitless economic growth is possible on a finite planet. But even the simplest of folks can grasp that when something cannot continue, it stops. We no longer need to ask, can we change the world? Because the world is inevitably going to change and is already changing. The future is not what it used to be. One way or another, change is coming because the status quo simply cannot be maintained. We are in the process of witnessing a self-destructive civilization collide with environmental limits. And increasingly people are going to suffer under this perverse system, and increasingly people are going to see that better, freer, less impactful and more compassionate ways of living are available. People will try to live those new worlds into existence. Both of these things, both the suffering under the existing system and the prefigurative new world imagination, are mobilizing forces. My prediction or hypothesis then is that this collective rumbling, this emerging matrix of global social movements, is only going to intensify and amplify. At some point, it may ignite in ways that currently our imaginations cannot even begin to grasp, or it may fade away into oblivion like other beacons of hope. Think of the Occupy movement, for example, which rose as quickly as it fell, even if Occupy induced valuable impacts and conversations that live on. Social movements have a tendency to surprise us. I'm not sure whether forthcoming environmental rebellions will be able to save the world as such, but I feel that they are destined to change the world as the world changes us. With that theoretical context provided, let me now spend some time examining the defining feature of XR, that is, an openness to civil disobedience as a strategy for change. What is civil disobedience, and when, if ever, can it be justified? In essence, civil disobedience can be defined as a public, non-violent and conscientious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about change in laws or government policies. For present purposes, I will assume that for disobedience to be civil, it has to be non-violent, and indeed this accords with the explicit and unconditional commitment XR has to non-violence. In an important aside, empirical studies show that movements committed to non-violent disobedience tend to be twice as successful in achieving their aims as violent demonstrations. So XR's principled commitment to non-violence is also pragmatic and evidence-based. One might also add that it's a strategy that's very diverse. Gene Sharp famously listed 198 ways to practice non-violent resistance. Before engaging in such acts, however, individuals and groups should ask themselves, can civil disobedience ever be justified in a democracy? Don't we always have an obligation to obey the law? It can be helpful to begin assessing civil disobedience in relation to basic democratic theory then. Imperfect though they are, many of us live in societies that have a strongly democratic self-image. Among other things, this means that citizens and permanent residents get to vote on who will represent them in government. Since in theory all citizens of democracies have an equal opportunity to influence the lawmaking process through the ballot box, it's generally assumed that we should obey the law because the democratic process is the best way to organise and structure society and develop public policy that serves the common good. From this perspective, an opponent to civil disobedience might argue as follows. We can't all break the law every time we disagree with it. Imagine how unstable society would be if that happened. If we don't like what's happening, we can campaign for change like everyone else, and if we succeed, we can vote the existing government out of power through the electoral process and vote in a new government. In this way, democratic societies are said to have created the institutions and processes needed for their own peaceful improvement. It may not be a perfect political system, but as Winston Churchill is reported to have said, it's the worst form of government except for all the others. So the main objection to civil disobedience is this. If you disagree with a law or a policy, don't break that law or policy. Instead, campaign to get it changed through the democratic process. If you are permitted to break the law just because you disagree with it, then why can't anyone break any law that they disagree with? At first instance, perhaps this objection seems quite powerful. Indeed, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that, quote, all resistance against the supreme legislative power is the greatest and most punishable crime in the Commonwealth, for it destroys its very foundations, unquote. If people only abide by laws they agree with, the rule of law would break down. To some extent, then, we might all have sympathy with the political assumption that we ought to obey laws, even laws we don't agree with. But it's one thing to make that broad and pragmatic concession. It's quite another to suggest that all laws always ought to be obeyed. If obedience to law were unconditional and absolute by virtue of the democratic process, it would follow that civil disobedience is always unjustified. How might acts of civil disobedience then be interpreted within the contested disciplines of legal and political theory? First of all, one might argue that civil disobedience is potentially justifiable when the mechanisms of democracy are not working properly, such that laws do not represent the will of the people. This can occur when laws and policies are shaped by the undemocratic influence of foreign governments, for example, or billionaires, mass media conglomerates, or other corporate lobby groups, for example, buying a politician's support. In such cases, one might suggest that laws produced by undemocratic processes do not demand our political allegiance, since they were not produced through a fair, robust, and representative democratic process. There is also a second way in which it might be argued that civil disobedience can at times be justified. That is, to recognize that there is a distinction between law and morality, or a distinction between what is law and what is just. Often we might admit there is much overlap between law and justice, and the more overlap the better. But any thinking person knows that often in history, and no doubt still today, there are times when we see a clear difference between law and justice, even if justice is an essentially contested term. In other words, democracy may be the best form of government, but this does not mean that democracy always gets things right. Rather, democracy, when it is functioning properly, reflects culture, and there is no reason to think that cultural norms and expectations are always just. Put more directly, a functioning democracy can produce unjust laws when a citizenry knowingly and voluntarily votes for policies that are unjust, even if they are not considered unjust by those voting for them. For example, we know that democracies have historically declared it illegal to engage in same-sex relationships, and today most members of liberal democracies recognize that such laws were and are in breach of basic civil rights. In the past, laws produced in democracies have institutionalized slavery, ratified unjust laws, legally entrenched racial segregation, criminalized homosexuality or particular religious practices, prohibited women and people of color from voting, and so forth. Again, what is law does not automatically overlap with what is just. Nobody can deny that unless they still believe in the divine right of kings, and I'm sure that no one thinks that today's world leaders are God's infallible messengers on earth, chosen to lead us to the promised land. At such times when a law or policy is clearly unjust, for example, recognizing the ownership of people as slaves, a case can be made that there is a place for civil disobedience in democratic societies on the grounds that we must accept that even democratically produced laws sometimes get it wrong, sometimes really wrong. And there is a rich and revered tradition in legal and political theory that recognizes and accepts these broad lines of argument. In other words, it's widely accepted that there is a proper place for civil disobedience even in liberal democratic societies. In fact, as we look back on social movements in history, whether it's Gandhi's campaign for independence, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, or Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes, some of the greatest leaps forward in social and political progress have been a result of acts of civil disobedience. It would show a gross lack of historical understanding to dismiss civil disobedience as a regressive social practice. The powerful but uncomfortable inference is that future acts of civil disobedience may also be required to advance our state of society today. So how does this apply to Extinction Rebellion? There are, as I've just implied, two main ways to evaluate civil disobedience. On the one hand, an argument could be made that we live in democracies that are at least partially broken, such that the laws and policies that are produced are sometimes undemocratic because of the undue influence corporate interests have had on the legislative process. For example, the fossil fuel industry, the Murdoch media, or other powerful economic forces. This suggests that even if our culture wanted a strong climate response, vested interests would interfere with any such response and ensure that law and policy kept things more or less as they are. To some extent, this may be part of the reason why climate policy around the world is often weak and sometimes non-existent. In the cynical words often attributed to Emma Goldman, if voting changed anything, it would be made illegal. One might say in the same vein, if lunatics have taken over the asylum, a case can be made for the citizenry to break the rules and establish new ones. Perhaps the more powerful argument for civil disobedience, however, is that overall dominant cultures today have yet to fully appreciate the magnitude of climate breakdown and the broader environmental crisis, perhaps due to powerful vested interests shaping public consciousness. After all, as noted earlier, It's still quite easy to distance ourselves from the impacts of these crises, and we also know that Australia, for example, has a current government that celebrates coal and essentially denies that climate breakdown is a problem deserving of a significant response. For these reasons, among others, the Australian government is each instant losing some of its integrity, and Australia is not alone, of course. So we might draw an analogy here with the anti-slavery or civil rights movement in the US, where once the state sanctioned and supported the moral wrongs of slavery and segregation, today the state sanctions and supports the moral wrong of climate breakdown. Activists who are engaged in civil disobedience during the civil rights movement might accept that white people were in fact voting for racist laws and public policy, but justify their disobedience on the grounds that racist laws and policies were wrong and deserved to be disobeyed. We simply cannot say that the anti-slavery activists or the civil rights activists were wrong to break the law and engage in non-violent acts of civil disobedience. Those racist laws were grossly immoral and they deserved to be disobeyed. Rosa Parks was right not to give up her seat on the bus on that fateful day in 1955, even though it violated laws and regulations. The question XR is asking of us is whether the unfolding catastrophes of climate change and species extinction are sufficiently severe that it is justified to break the law to stop this system. According to Henry Thoreau, who published his famous essay on civil disobedience in 1849, this strategy is not just a right but at times a duty. It is no surprise then that Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Emmeline Pankhurst and countless other social activists have been inspired to engage in such acts and are now revered for their bravery. Let us ask with Thoreau, are we expected to resign our conscience to the legislator? Why have a conscience if we are simply expected to uncritically affirm all acts of government? We must be human beings first and subjects of the state afterward, as Thoreau argued. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for law so much as for the right. And indeed, he insisted that respect for law can at times make us daily agents of injustice. In relation to his own time, Thoreau argued that one could not be associated with the US government without disgrace, for he could not recognize as his government what was also the slave's government. He argued that if a government's law is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then break the law. Quote, "Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine," he declared. "Cast your whole vote, not a strip of paper merely, but your whole influence." Since its emergence, thousands of XR activists have been arrested for engaging in civil disobedience. While no one should fetishize being arrested as the only way to participate in XR, and the movement should recognize also that people have different so-called biographical availabilities for being arrested, the fact is that all acts of civil disobedience raise the possibility of being arrested and perhaps imprisoned. No doubt acts of civil disobedience will be perceived by many as annoying and inconvenient and unnecessarily disruptive, but that calculus always has to be weighed against the moral wrong that is motivating the civil disobedience. Slavery and segregation were also inconvenient for those who suffered under racist laws. In that light, the inconvenience caused by sit-ins and bus boycotts during the civil rights movements pale in comparison to the wrongs being resisted. Similarly, when environmentalists engage in acts of civil disobedience to resist ecocide, the extinction of species and the unfolding climate emergency, some sectors of society will no doubt be appalled and dismiss the activists as common lawbreakers or radical anarchists. Civil disobedience may indeed be inconvenient to many people, but to evaluate the legitimacy of civil disobedience, one has to resist superficial analyses and ask how that inconvenience compares to the future suffering and indeed the suffering already being caused by environmental breakdown. I can now bring the analysis to a head. Just imagine, for example, that in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, it doesn't really matter when, we discover that our high-impact modes of production and consumption have led to even more alarming ecosystemic breakdown, a future that has mountains of scientific support to suggest it's likely. Suppose the climate reaches its tipping point. Australia and other nations enter indeterminate and intensifying drought. Food production drops even as population grows, leading to mass famine and increased geopolitical tension and war. Suppose in 10 or 20 years the Arctic ice cap disappears, and the methane release from the permafrost induces a swift jump in global temperatures. Suppose any number of such highly plausible things happen and people begin to die in greater numbers. When we look back on today, we will ask ourselves, did we do enough? Were we complicit in a broken system? Should we have been so obedient given that we knew our gutless governments were leading us down a dead end? These questions are not for me to answer. I'm still struggling with them myself. I will remain a sympathetic critic of XR and revise my views as new evidence and insight emerges. None of us can condemn or condone the actions of XR in advance of their particular context-dependent manifestations. One might sympathise with XR in general while disagreeing with specifics or vice versa. These are very personal questions with social effects upon which we must meditate with due diligence. But my point is that if the future turns out how the scientists are predicting it will, if business as usual continues, then the younger generation might well ask what we did to resist the foreseeable collapse of ecosystems and the humanitarian catastrophe such breakdowns will induce and are already inducing. Writing in the 19th century, Karl Marx announced that he had discovered the laws of history. He maintained that it was inevitable that as the contradictions of capitalism became ever more severe and transparent, eventually the working class would rise up and overthrow the capitalist class and establish communism. I've always been suspicious of determinist conceptions of history, knowing that human societies just do not follow predetermined laws. I feel that we will be what we make of ourselves and nothing else, as the existentialists argued, even if we are born into a world not of our own making. But when we freely act in ways that undermine the ecosystems that we and future generations depend on for freedom and prosperity, then our lives begin to be shaped not so much by human decisions as by ecological realities and geological forces. At least human freedom is increasingly contained and influenced by those worsening realities and forces. We are living in such times today. What Marx never foresaw was that capitalism would indeed fall, but not by way of revolution, but by way of deterioration and perhaps collapse. As the broad ecological crisis intensifies and collapse situations become more common, challenging and disruptive, I've argued that more and more people will face their psychological tipping points and become engaged in collective action. At some point, tolerance of ecocide will become intolerable. What is your threshold? What is the threshold of your neighbour, your children or parents, your work colleagues, our politicians? I don't know, but my sense is that those tipping points are approaching if they haven't already passed. If not tomorrow, then next month or next year or the year after that. The rebellion hypothesis, as presented, is that every day more people are saying to themselves, I have to be an activist of some form. I'm a change maker, not a passive consumer. I'm responsible for participating in progressive social change. I want to be. I have to be. The question we must all face as global citizens on a dying planet is whether our governments are meeting their fundamental duty to keep us, our children, and the broader community of life safe. Rebellion, I'm suggesting, has effectively become a law of history due to ecological realities. The climate crisis is already here, to some extent locked in, and certainly threatening to get much worse. 300 years of industrial momentum means that it is now too late for any smooth, non-disruptive democratic shift to some ecological civilization. For better or worse, turbulence and disruption will define coming decades. Things are likely to get worse before they get better. But as this happens, people will inevitably be mobilized as the calculus of apathy and inaction shifts and the activist is born. As Camus declared earlier, everything begins in that moment of wariness tinged with amazement. In 6 months or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, I invite you to reflect back on this presentation and assess to what extent you think the hypothesis presented has been verified by growing global social movements or falsified by increased apathy. I feel confident, for the reasons I've outlined, that the future will confirm my prediction. If I am wrong and the status quo endures, then all the worse for us. In short, I feel the logic of rebellion is becoming irresistible to more and more people, and that this trend is destined to continue. And one implication of this is that we should not conceive of XR as something already riding the crest of a wave, but rather XR represents a movement of movements that is still in its infancy. This entails the prospect of something much bigger that is still in the process of being born, even though it may be that the hour is the darkest just before dawn. Still, the promise of a new dawn is not needed to justify the rejection of a world immiserated by capitalism's violent overreach. In closing, I've invited you today to ask yourself, what are the costs and benefits of inaction? What are the costs and benefits of resistance and rebellion? What are the costs and benefits of building a new world arm in arm with your neighbour? My argument has been that this calculus is already shifting in favour of resistance, rebellion and renewal, and that the shift is now unstoppable whether one sympathises with XR or not. But don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that things are necessarily going to turn out well. That remains to be seen, and it's hard not to retain a degree of pessimism. What I've been arguing is that as environmental pressures continue to be felt by more immediately and personally by more people, and as more people are exposed to small-scale examples of more sustainable and humane ways of living and organising society, the world will begin to shift. People will be less inclined to passively accept the existing order and be far more inclined to be active shapers of their lives and their communities. And when this shift intensifies, we must do everything we can to direct the change toward an ecological civilization and inhibit any further descent into barbarism. We are at this crossroads and must choose our fate. XR is part of this shift, but the global movement and energy are broader than any one framing or articulation. The floodgates are holding for the time being, but the laws of physics will win out as they always do. Participants in XR are early adopters, and if warnings of ecological science are to be taken seriously and prove even vaguely accurate, this movement, despite the negative press it will inevitably receive from some sectors of society, is almost certainly going to end up on the right side of history. If you have stuck with me to this late stage, well done, and thanks for your attention. I'll leave it there for the time being. There are more links in the description below for those who would like to dive deeper. See you next time, or better yet, see you in the streets or at the community garden.